Welcome to This Moment in Democracy. I'm Saladin Ambar, and this episode was recorded on February 15th, 2024. Today, we are joined by Lee Drutman to talk about recent voting trends and how our current voting mechanisms may be doing more harm than good. Drutman is the author of Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, The Case for Multi-Party Democracy in America. He's a senior fellow at the think tank New America, a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, the co-host of the podcast Politics in Question, and the co-founder of Fix Our House, a campaign for proportional representation in America. Lee, thanks for joining us on This Moment in Democracy.
Great to be with you, Dean.
I want to start with the title of your book, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop. That sounds dramatic. Why is it a doom loop? What is the fundamental problem, as you see it, or challenge with our two-party system?
It is a dramatic title. The publisher insisted on it, and they were right.
I hear you.
Turns out. Yeah, so Doom Loop is basically a catchy name for a recursive feedback loop, which is, if you think like a microphone up against a speaker, where the speaker picks up the microphone and then it echoes it back until it blows out the speaker too, which nobody likes. And the idea is that in this political moment, we have two parties that are deeply sorted geographically and culturally, fighting for knife's edge control of the nation and increasingly demonizing each other and escalating the stakes of conflict and bifurcating reality in the process. And it's really hard to have a functioning democracy when you don't have a shared understanding of what electoral legitimacy is, when you don't have a shared set of facts. And when you fundamentally view your political opponents not as people you disagree with, but as people who are evil, maybe even not Americans or not worthy of American citizenship, and that fundamentally undermines this challenge that we've always had, which is how do you bring a diverse pluralist society into one coherent polity, and it is especially existential at this moment, I think, as more and more Americans are increasingly open to violence, increasingly willing to see their party do whatever it takes to win, regardless of whether that fits with our understanding of democratic procedure. And it just feeds on itself. Their distrust feeds on distrust. Angry, negative, polarizing rhetoric feeds on angry, polarizing rhetoric. And problem is it won't resolve on its own, because we are in a binary two-party system where it's either your side or my side. You're either with us or you're against us. There's no middle ground in this system. And as a result, we are driving ourselves crazy and undermining the foundations of our democracy.
I hear you. But I'm wondering how this plays out differently in a multi-party system. I'm thinking visually here. So you mentioned the bifurcated system we have. And I'm thinking of like a Mark Rothko painting, where you got a green or a blue side by side. And that's one vision of reality. But then you have maybe a Jackson Pollock. But why is the spattering of anger, maybe, or volatility any better than perhaps that bifurcated reality? My daughter's going to hate this because she hates Mark Rothko, but that's neither here nor there.
Oh, well, why is the Mark Rothko?
There you go. I'm going to talk
and
to
Jackson Pollock. I love the modernist abstract painters.
Yeah. So why does the Pollock multiplicity? Why is that more helpful?
Well, I'll just say that when you actually sit and stare at a Rothko, it's a lot more complicated than that simple bifurcation. But at a first glance, it does look like it's just a two-color panel. So, I mean, but to take it out of art criticism and get back to political
Sure.
criticism, why is having more parties healthier? And the, the reality is that we are a diverse and pluralistic country. The idea that everybody should fit in one of two parties is just absurd given the scale and size of our nation. And leaves a lot of people feeling like neither party represents them. And the two parties themselves are actually quite heterogeneous. But the only way that they can hold things together is by demonizing the other, right? That's the thing that binds all Republicans together is they're not Democrats. It's the thing that binds all Democrats together. They're not Republicans. And that necessity of using a common enemy to mobilize your side is extremely heightened in this moment as the country grows more and more diverse, even within the parties. Now, if you broke the parties up, and I don't want to have like 200 parties or even 10 parties. I think a reasonable number is five or six. There are some consequences to having too many parties. Things become too fragmented, and but within that, you can see that there are more different ways of understanding the world. When you get locked in this binary dynamic, it really shuts down your thinking almost, where the world becomes very good versus evil, becomes very simplistic, and it makes it hard to find complex multidimensional compromises, which are essential in politics. When I look around the world, and there's been a growing political science scholarship looking at why is the U.S. so affectively polarized, which is, of course, the fancy political science term for people hate people of the opposing party. And it turns out that there's a tremendous and significant correlation between how many parties there are and how people feel about opposing partisans. And new research coming out suggests that a lot of this has to do with the fact that when there are more parties, coalitions are more fluid, so there are fewer permanent enemies and
Hmm.
more people who see, well, we've been in coalition with this party at various times, and we've been in opposition with this other party. So, like, they can't
That's
be that
interesting.
bad.
Yeah.
But when it's the same conflict over and over and over and over again, you really start to demonize. I mean, there's very classic in-group experiments where you arbitrarily divide some group of kids into, the people, if we're going on the art theme, you may know this famous study where there are the people who were told that they're Kandinsky lovers and people who were told that they were Paul Klee lovers, and then they started disliking and saying nasty things about each other. Totally arbitrary categorization in the binary treatment. But interestingly, I went looking for this at some point that when you break people into more groups, there's none of that in group, out group. It just you don't get you don't get that level of hatred when there are more groups. There's something hardwired in our brain to want to simplify the world into friend versus foe, and when that doesn't happen, we become more tolerant of other people. Uh, there's no lesser of three evils. There's only the lesser of two evils.
Right. Well, that's fascinating. I've never quite heard it put that way before. But let's talk about that third uh, category because you in your most recent Substack article you say that 20% of the electorate do not fall into either partisan camp. You refer to them as shrug emoji voters, which is a term I wish I was clever enough to have invented. That's pretty great.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's
Appreciate that.
terrific. You say they're the least knowledgeable. Who are these shrug emoji voters, and why do people who don't like politics hold the fate of the country in their hands? It seems.
Right. So, in this piece, I kind of break down the electorate roughly into, 40% solid Republican, 40% solid Democrat, and then 20% shrug emoji, which is sort of like, I don't know.
Right.
I mean, I guess maybe I'll vote, maybe I won't. And I mean, even within this category, a lot of these voters will consistently vote for one party or the other, but they may just not vote at all, depending on the election. And they don't care that much about what's going on in Washington. They're busy with their own lives. Often they're struggling a bit financially. They tend to be younger, tend to be more voters of color who are just, really. I feel like politics is just this really distant thing. Nobody cares about them, and they just don't have any connection to it. And that's a real problem for any number of reasons. Uh,
Sure.
we can go down, but they might vote, they might not, and a lot of these, a lot of our elections, because we're in this knife's edge, almost 50-50 politics. It really depends on which section of these pretty much disengaged voters decide to show up. And mostly they're voting because they dislike one party or one candidate. They're not mobilized generally in excitement for one candidate or other. They're just sort of real anti-system voters. I mean, to the extent that they seem to be energized about any candidate in this election, probably RFK Jr.,
Right. Yeah.
who's, really channeling a lot of that. Everybody's corrupt, can't trust anybody, energy that I think a lot of people, really do feel. And I don't think it's crazy for a lot of people to feel that way because that's how they're treated by the political system.
Well, yeah, in actuality, that 20% number, when you pull the lens back, I imagine is a lot higher in terms of people who don't participate at all
Right,
in
right.
politics,
So,
right?
and
Sure.
these are the
Yeah.
right. So it would be much higher. I mean, the U.S. has consistently one of the lowest voter turnout rates of any advanced democracy. And, again,
Yeah.
you see a clear correlation across countries. Countries with more parties and more proportional representation have higher turnout because there's more voters who, one, see their vote as actually mattering. And two, there are more parties that will be out there trying to engage different sections of the electorate. And voters are more likely to feel like, well, hey, there's a party that I actually feel like I want to vote for. And that turns out actually having a positive feeling about some party and some party's candidates is pretty important and it also makes people feel better about democracy, by the way.
Sure. I don't think that's a big leap at all. I could totally see the logic in that. You mentioned the importance of political parties here in the context of electoral reform, a multiplicity of parties. Could you explain further how fusion voting, which you talk quite a bit about, and proportional representation might impact the role and function of parties in American democracy going forward? Unlike lots of political scientists, you propose some remedies to these challenges.
Uh,
Maybe why don't we take a stab first at fusion voting? What is it, first of all?
Right. So fusion voting actually was widespread throughout the 19th century in the United States, and fundamental idea behind fusion voting is that multiple parties should be able to nominate the same candidate if that candidate wants the endorsement. So, in New York, for example, where fusion voting has been legal for a long time, in the 2020 election, you could vote for Joe Biden on the Democratic Party line, or you could vote for Joe Biden on the Working Families Party line. Now, the Working Families Party exists in New York, and it's a more progressive, particularly on economic issues, party that usually endorses the Democratic candidate. Sometimes will run its own candidate, but it gets a share of the vote, and that gives it some bargaining power. Whereas the voters who want a more progressive vision of the Democratic Party would have no way to signal that in the election. Now, for a long time, the challenge in American politics was that the two major parties didn't differentiate themselves enough. And I think a lot of voters who are more on progressive or conservative ends of the political spectrum felt that they didn't really have a voice. Over the last 2 decades, that has flipped entirely. And now the fundamental challenge is that a lot of voters who feel that they are in the center, and the parties have moved too far to the fringes, are without a voice. And so now there's a real challenge, which is how do you give these more center-oriented voters uh, a way to organize and to have a political voice and to cast a meaningful vote. And again, Fusion offers an opportunity there because they're not going to be able to run their own candidate in most single member districts where third parties are spoilers and wasted votes and basically not serious because they can't be. Uh, but a ballot line is important. Get 10% on that ballot line, and now you're a meaningful political party, and you're bringing together people around a shared identity. You're giving people a sense that their vote matters, that their vote is important, and you're creating more parties, which I'm big believer political parties are the essential institutions of modern representative mass democracy because they connect citizens to their government. They make elections meaningful. They make politics coherent. But in our unless we move to a more proportional system, which I would like us to do, but I think it takes some time within the single member district. The best way to start seeing more parties organize is to give them a place on the ballot. And I think it would be very powerful.
And before we get to that proportional representative model, just a little bit about you mentioned that our sister republic, at least from the New Jersey perspective, New York, having fusion voting. New Jersey is in a bit of a different situation, is it not? My understanding is the ACLU is currently fighting a ban of fusion voting in the state. What can you share with us about what's going on in New Jersey with respect to fusion voting?
Yeah, there is a lawsuit in the New Jersey State Supreme Court, in which a group of voters in the 7th Congressional District are asking the state to re-legalize fusion. Fusion was legal in New Jersey up until 1911, and they formed the moderate party in the 2022 midterm election in the 7th Congressional District. They wanted to endorse Tom Malinowski on the moderate party line. These are mostly independents and Republicans who feel like the Republican Party has left them. The idea of voting for a Democrat is anathema to them, but they want to be able to support a candidate on the moderate party line. Now, Secretary of State had to rule that as not legal because it's not. But there are a lot of smart lawyers who think that the New Jersey state constitution should protect the freedom of association. Uh, that is, should allow a party to choose to associate with a candidate and a candidate to choose to associate with a party. So that case is, it's going, it's hopefully there'll be a decision, and I think it would be a tremendously important uh, decision if the state Supreme Court sees the value in this freedom of association and the ability of the moderate party of New Jersey to have a ballot line that it can offer to either the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate or run its own candidate. But the ability to offer that ballot line gives that party a meaningful presence and gives a space for people who feel like they don't belong to either party to
Right.
have a place that they can belong to. I mean, I think that there is broadly beyond just electoral stuff. There is a tremendous crisis of belonging in this country. And I think political parties are one institution that can pull in people and give people a sense of collective purpose. There are many other institutions that can do that. But right now, the two major political parties are really failing at that. They're just basically mailing lists asking people for money at this point.
Well,
It's just so they can run more advertisements.
so thus far we have as a remedy to our current crisis, this doom loop, we need more parties. You're suggesting, stating, we need fusion voting, which will create more local and perhaps national opportunities for representativeness. What about proportional representation? You just share a little bit about that and what your hopes are.
Yeah, so proportional representation it describes really a family of voting systems in which the number of percentage of votes that a party gets within a district should correspond roughly to the number of seats that it gets within a district. And that requires larger districts. You can't just do that with a single member district because single member districts are extremely disproportionate. You get 51% of the vote, you get 100% of the seats. Well, one seat. But as you move to larger districts, you can have more proportional allocation of seats. And this is used in most democracies around the world. There are various forms of it, but the basic idea is that by lowering the threshold percentage required to win some representation within a district, you make it possible for more parties to compete. You also eliminate gerrymandering, which is really only a consequence of small districts, particularly single member districts, and you allow every vote everywhere to matter equally because your vote counts in every district. You don't
Right.
have to live in a swing
Right.
district in order for your vote to count. I mean, right now we're down to about maybe 10, maybe a little more, 10 or so percent of congressional districts that are, really competitive between the two parties. So it means 90% of people are living in a district where basically they don't get a chance to vote in a competitive election. Maybe the primary election is competitive. In most cases, the incumbent just
Right.
runs unopposed.
Sure. Well, look, I would be remiss if I did not ask you about ranked choice voting. You've been identified with ranked choice voting as a supporter, although maybe a little bit of a robust supporter of late. You share your thoughts about what ranked choice voting is, but also why it matters and may not matter as much to the healing process of our democracy going forward.
Yeah, so I used to be a very enthusiastic about ranked choice voting, and as I've seen it be implemented and it play out in various places, I've cooled a little bit on it. I still think it has some positive uh, qualities, particularly in local nonpartisan elections and in primary elections, where there's a fair amount of overlap with the candidates. So you're trying to find a sort of consensus winner when there is a real space for consensus. But as polarization at a national level has gotten so much worse and more districts have become solidly one party or the other, I'm just not really seeing how it can lead to the emergence of more parties, and particularly how it can rehabilitate what the vanishing political center. I'm just not seeing the evidence for it. I've also seen more and more concerns about how certain voters, particularly lower income voters, are struggling with the ability to manage all that ranking. That it makes it a little bit more confusing for voters because it deprives voters of some of the more familiar cues of party endorsements that help busy voters, right? I mean, I think
Right.
a lot of voters are incredibly busy. We talked about a lot of the folks who are disengaged from politics. But again, political parties are really important because they do quality. They should do quality control, and they help voters to understand who are these people. And a lot of voters just have one candidate that they support, and then that gets all this complex ranking stuff. So I still see some important benefits of ranked choice voting, particularly again in sort of crowded primaries and crowded local elections where there's a fair bit of overlap among candidates, but I don't see it as either bringing back the political center at a national level or leading to the emergence of new parties, which I think are both the most important things that we need in this political moment.
Well, I really appreciate and value the way you've, given tremendous thought to each of these remedies or possible ways out of the morass we're in with respect to, national disaffectedness towards our political system. I think it's important to think about these. But I'm also perhaps more impressed by this comment you made earlier about this, which is not so much in the weeds, but is sort of this larger problem of a sense of belonging, the absence of belonging, a sense of loneliness that people have written about in more recent years, and connecting that to the need for political engagement, particularly through political parties. Given that I don't know what you'd call it, that state of social anxiety, disaffection is there. How do we get to that third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh party world, this multi-party world in this country that you think is at the root of helping us solve some of these political problems?
Well, fundamentally, we need to change our electoral institutions. We have a system of single winner elections, and single winner elections make it very hard for third parties to compete. So if we move to proportional multi-member districts, we will have more vibrant parties within the single winner system. Fusion voting does create a tremendous opportunity for new parties to form and get in the political game and bring in a lot of voters who really are disaffected with the current system and channel them towards a more positive, productive vision of how they can engage in politics, as opposed to just saying, well, you got to pick one of these two parties, and or you can vote for some, blow up the system outsider. And that's what happens when you don't give people enough choices. Eventually, they support the outsider demagogue. That's how Venezuela got Hugo Chavez, for example. And Venezuela was widely seen as a thriving, healthy democracy for a long time, and then you had a lot of people feeling like neither of the parties really represented them. Eventually, Chavez channeled that power.
Well, given our current state of at times political absurdity, and here I'm thinking about the villainization of someone like Taylor Swift, which you've written about by Republicans. Do you think the end game that we're hoping for here in this larger political world, more participation, more parties, would put a stop or alleviate that sort of thing? And what do you think that's all about? Is this just another way of well, you tell me what is up with that kind of symbology going on here?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of it is just attempting to draw lines. And, again, when politics is all or nothing, zero sum. If you're not on our side, then you're against us. But when you have more parties and more fluid lines and more shifting coalitions, drawing those binary lines is just doesn't make sense, really, because it's just not how politics operates in a more fluid, multi-faction, multi-party system. So I don't know I don't know how. It just feels
It's
like
okay to laugh. It's okay to laugh, Lee.
I do it so I don't cry.
Right.
Same release. Eventually something has to give, right? Things can't go on like this forever, but they can go on like this for longer than we would think. But I think about the broader scope of American history. And it does seem like there's a somewhat cyclical nature to our politics, in that there are moments in which things feel tremendously broken and feels like things can't go on, and then something gives. And what seems rigid is also brittle.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you saying that because we failed to realize that, and a lot of these reforms that you're referring to go back right to the progressive era. There were some breakthroughs in challenging party politics as they were, maybe some good, some not so good, but at a minimum, there were some breakthroughs, and I think you're suggesting that some may well be on the horizon, or at least you're hopeful.
I mean, I think there are certainly some real similarities to the progressive era. Certainly in the late Gilded Age, tremendous partisan polarization, tremendous economic inequality, tremendous frustration with the political system. And eventually, a large, somewhat fractious, but still large coalition of reformers changed the way we do elections. Again, I think they made a core mistake in trying to take parties out of politics as opposed to listening to the American Proportional Representation League. They banned fusion voting in most states, which I think was a mistake. Direct primary, I think, was a mistake. Direct election of senators, I think, was good. Enfranchising women was very good. So, a mixed bag, but electoral institutions are not as fixed as we tend to think they are. And sometimes people say, "Oh, well, the U.S. is naturally a two-party system," but that's not true. Throughout the 20th century, it has mostly been a two-party system, but throughout the 19th century, it was a much more vibrant. Infusion allowed the Free Soil Party and the Liberty Party and lots of populist parties, and so you had some interesting coalitions and interesting minor parties under a different system. So the idea that the U.S. is naturally a two-party system, the framers, they thought there were going to be no political parties.
Right.
I mean, but Madison did fundamentally get it right with this idea that in order to manage faction, you have to have fluid coalitions. And if you have one dominant faction trying to dominate another dominant faction, you get civil war, which is what we got the one moment when that our politics broke down that way.
Indeed, indeed. Well, listen, Lee, I appreciate you putting up with my bad art analogies, and also more importantly, informing our listeners about the need for a more robust democracy involving perhaps some form of ranked choice voting, proportional representation, fusion voting, and onward. Thank you for sharing these views. I think they're really important, and appreciate you sharing your time with us today.
Well, thank you, Dean. There's a real art to using analogies, and I think you captured it.
Today's podcast has been brought to you by the Eagleton Institute of Politics. Eagleton is a nonpartisan research unit of Rutgers University, New Brunswick. This moment in democracy was made possible in part by the generosity of Gerald and Kiko Harvey and Eagleton's many supporters. To support Eagleton's work or sign up for its newsletter, click the links in the description. Please help support the work we do at this moment in democracy. Visit our podcast page at eagleton.rutgers.edu to learn more. We want to hear from our listeners. Email us at podcast@eagleton.rutgers.edu to send in your comments about today's episode or suggest topics that you want to hear about. That's all for today. Thank you for joining us on This Moment in Democracy.